July 18th, 1944. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea. The waves rolled against the steel hull of the U.S. Navy's USS Benevolence, a white-painted hospital ship marked with bold red crosses that gleamed under the tropical sun. The air was thick with salt and the faint, lingering scent of disinfectant. Below deck, the hum of generators mixed with the rhythmic clatter of surgical trays. For the men inside, it was a sanctuary amidst a world of ruin. But for the newly arrived Japanese prisoners of war, it was something closer to confusion, even disbelief. They had been captured 2 days earlier, survivors from a shattered convoy bombed off Guam. Most were badly burned or half-starved, some missing limbs, others delirious from dehydration. For them, capture by the Americans meant one thing: humiliation, perhaps torture, and likely death. That was what they had been taught since their first day in uniform. Now they stood, barefoot, silent, trembling, on the deck of a ship painted in white. The Red Cross emblem on the hull glared back at them like some alien symbol. U.S. Marines watched from a distance, rifles lowered but ready. And then came the order from a calm, steady voice. "Bring them below. Triage Ward 3. Lieutenant Commander Harold Pierce, Chief Medical Officer, spoke without hesitation. His team moved swiftly, nurses in crisp white uniforms, corpsmen with medical kits strapped to their belts. The Japanese soldiers flinched when the Americans approached, expecting the worst. But instead of blows, they received bandages. Instead of jeers, words of reassurance. A young corpsman knelt beside one of the prisoners, a 19-year-old private named Kenji Sato. Shrapnel had torn through his thigh, and infection had already set in. The corpsman, Petty Officer First Class Thomas Riley, spoke gently as he cleaned the wound. "Easy, buddy. You're going to be all right." Kenji stared at him, eyes wide, lips trembling. He didn't understand the words, but the tone? It was unmistakably kind. His world had been built on the belief that Americans were monsters. Yet here was one, carefully wrapping his leg, whispering comfort as if he were his own brother. Nearby, another prisoner, a sergeant named Nakamura, watched in stunned silence. Back in his own army, a wounded man like Sato would have been left to die to save supplies. Here, even an enemy was being stitched back together. Pierce oversaw the ward like a commander on the battlefield, efficient, composed. "Plasma for bed 4. Morphine 0.5. Keep him conscious," he ordered, pointing towards a Japanese lieutenant pale with blood loss. No one questioned the command. No one hesitated because of the red insignia on the patient's uniform. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sea in molten gold. Inside the ship, lamps glowed softly, illuminating rows of cots filled with both American and Japanese wounded. Some separated by language, others by bandages alone. Kenji, half conscious, turned his head toward the next bed. An American sailor, his arm missing from the shoulder, met his gaze. The two men said nothing. They didn't need to. Both had seen the same sky filled with fire, heard the same screams of dying comrades, and now, both breathed the same air of uneasy mercy. That night, as the ship swayed gently beneath the stars, Nakamura muttered something under his breath, something that even the interpreter didn't catch fully. It was a prayer, or perhaps an apology. He had never imagined that an enemy could treat him as human. And in that quiet ward aboard the USS Benevolence, a silence deeper than the ocean settled among the men. It was not fear anymore. It was the beginning of disbelief. One that would ripple through every Japanese prisoner who ever stepped on to an American hospital ship.
July 19, 1944, aboard the USS Benevolence, Central Pacific. Morning broke with the faint clang of the ship's bell and the low murmur of ocean wind. The Red Cross flags fluttered softly above the deck as sunlight filtered through portholes, painting streaks of gold across the white interior. Nurses moved briskly from bed to bed, their soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the linoleum floor. The scent of iodine and sea air hung in the room, mingling like two worlds forced together. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a world they could not comprehend. Private Kenji Sato awoke to find a nurse adjusting his IV. She was young, barely 22, with auburn hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. When she noticed his eyes open, she smiled gently. "Good morning," she said, though she didn't understand. Her tone alone carried warmth. She gestured toward the water jug and mimed drinking. Kenji hesitated, then nodded slowly. The cool water against his throat felt like forgiveness. Across the ward, Commander Pierce reviewed the morning reports. 34 patients aboard, 9 of them Japanese, 2 in surgery, 3 in recovery, 1 critical. He rubbed his tired eyes. The war outside was unrelenting, but inside these white walls, it was suspended. His duty was clear. Every life that entered the ship, enemy or ally, was under his care. "Doctor," called one of the interpreters, a Nisei from California, named Henry Aoki. He spoke fluent Japanese and had become the fragile bridge between the two worlds on board. "The new prisoners are asking why we're helping them." Pierce looked up, setting his pen down. "Tell them because it's what we do," he said simply. Aoki hesitated before translating. When the words reached the prisoners, the ward fell silent again. Some exchanged glances, skeptical, wary. Others looked away, ashamed. They had seen their own Navy leave wounded men behind to drown. They had watched as their medics carried cyanide tablets instead of morphine. To be treated like this by an enemy was not just unexpected, it was shattering. Sergeant Nakamura, his leg in traction, struggled to sit up. "America, naze," he murmured. "Why?" "Because this ship is a hospital, not a battlefield." Later that afternoon, Nakamura watched as American and Japanese doctors worked side by side to treat a critical case, a Japanese ensign whose abdomen had been shredded by shrapnel. The lead surgeon, Commander Pierce, called out for instruments, his gloved hands steady. Sweat dripped from his brow as the ship rocked beneath them. When the operation ended after 2 exhausting hours, the ensign was alive. Barely, but alive. The Japanese prisoners watched the stretcher pass by in silence. Not a single word was spoken. For many, it was the first time they had seen an American risk his own strength to save one of them. That night, the sea outside glowed under a half moon. From the deck, you could see faint flashes on the horizon. Some distant naval bombardment, reminders that the war still burned just beyond sight. But inside, the USS Benevolence floated like a world apart. The hum of machines, the soft rhythm of footsteps, the quiet breathing of the wounded. It all felt unreal, fragile, sacred. Kenji stared at the ceiling above his bunk, the white paint glowing faintly under the dim lamps. His body ached, but his thoughts churned harder. The enemy he'd been told was savage had given him food, medicine, and mercy. He clenched his fist against the blanket, unsure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Because in his heart, he could not deny it any longer. What he had seen on this ship had already begun to break everything he had been taught to believe. Aboard the USS Benevolence, 80 miles east of Guam. The morning began with the sound of footsteps and the metallic hiss of sterilizers heating for another round of surgeries. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly, an ocean of calm hiding the violence that still raged just beyond the horizon. Inside the hospital ship, time moved differently. There were no battle cries, no commands, only the steady pulse of life being restored one heartbeat at a time. Commander Harold Pierce leaned over a chart at the nurse's station, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours in 2 days. The wounded kept coming, Americans, Filipinos, and now even Japanese. He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. We patch them up, send them back to camps. That's the best we can do. Beside him, Lieutenant Margaret Doyle, one of the senior nurses, replied quietly, They look at us like we're ghosts, sir, like they can't believe we're real. Pierce nodded slowly. They were told we had no mercy. Guess it's our job to prove them wrong. Down in Ward 3, Private Kenji Sato struggled to lift himself up on one elbow. The stitches on his thigh burned, but he ignored it. Across the aisle, Sergeant Nakamura was being examined by a U.S. doctor, assisted by the Japanese-speaking interpreter, Corporal Aoki. Tell him, said the doctor, that his leg's healing fine, but he needs to stay off it for another week. Aoki translated. Nakamura listened quietly, then lowered his gaze. After a pause, he muttered something that stopped Aoki mid-sentence. He says, in his army, they would have let him die, that to live after being captured is shameful. The doctor froze. Shameful? Aoki nodded. He says it's better to die than live as a prisoner. That's what they were taught. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the doctor exhaled softly. Well, maybe he'll learn something new here. As hours turned to days, that lesson began to spread, not through lectures, but through quiet acts of humanity. When an American sailor lost consciousness in the night, it was Nakamura who called out for the nurse first. When supplies ran low, Kenji insisted his own rations be shared with the wounded Marine. The barriers between enemy and ally began to blur, replaced by something wordless and fragile. On the 4th day, Commander Pierce gathered the prisoners together in the mess hall, a narrow space lit by low-hanging lamps. Through the interpreter, he addressed them plainly. You are soldiers, he said. You fought for your country. We respect that. But on this ship, you are patients. That means you will be treated the same as any of ours. A silence followed. Some prisoners kept their heads low, others blinked rapidly, hiding emotion behind rigid faces. For the first time, someone had looked at them not as captives, but as men. That night, as the Benevolence glided through the Black Sea, a quiet hum echoed across the decks. The low murmur of nurses checking vitals, the rattle of instruments being sterilized, and the whisper of prayers in 2 different languages. In his bunk, Kenji Sato clutched a folded piece of paper given to him by Nurse Doyle. On it, in careful English handwriting, was a single word. Hope. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with his bandaged finger. He didn't understand how one word could carry so much weight. But as the engines hummed and the ship drifted onward through the dark Pacific, Kenji realized that hope was not a thing he had to understand. It was simply something he had been given by those he once called his enemies. 44. The Pacific Ocean, en route to Pearl Harbor. The sea was calm that morning, a glassy blue stretching forever beneath the rising sun. The USS Benevolence cut through the waves with slow dignity, its white hull gleaming, the great red crosses on its sides visible for miles. It was a strange kind of vessel, a ship that sailed through war zones, yet carried no guns. Inside, the air was filled with a rhythm of normalcy. Nurses changed bandages, doctors dictated notes, and the wounded, both American and Japanese, stirred under clean sheets. But beneath that routine lay something profound. The ship had become a floating contradiction, a place of compassion adrift in an ocean of hatred. Private Kenji Sato sat near a porthole, propped up by pillows. His leg was healing, the pain no longer unbearable. Outside, he could see flying fish darting over the surface of the waves. For the first time since capture, he was allowed to sit by the light, unguarded. Corporal Aoki approached with a tray of breakfast, rice and eggs, simple but warm. "You're getting stronger," he said in Japanese. Kenji nodded slowly. "I don't understand," he said, his voice low but steady. "Why do you help us? We killed your men." Aoki set down the tray and looked out the porthole. "Because hate doesn't heal anyone, and this ship exists to heal." Kenji thought about that for a long time. Back home, his teachers had told him that Americans were cruel, that surrender was dishonor, that mercy was weakness. Yet here was a ship built entirely around mercy, moving through war like a ghost refusing to carry death. Later that afternoon, Commander Pierce held a briefing with his staff. He looked worn but proud. He said, "We've done good work. Those prisoners came aboard expecting to die. Instead, they'll live. Some will even walk again." Lieutenant Doyle smiled faintly. "They'll remember this, sir." Pierce nodded. "That's the point. Maybe when they go home, they'll tell others what they saw here. Maybe that's how this madness ends. Not with another bomb, but with a story." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, casting long shadows across the deck, a small group of Japanese prisoners stood together by the rail under guard. None tried to escape. They simply stared at the waves, speaking softly among themselves. Nakamura, the older sergeant, turned to Kenji. "When I see how they treat their wounded, even us, I think maybe everything we were told was a lie." Kenji said nothing. The ocean roared below them, carrying the ship onward. After a long pause, he whispered, "If I ever see Japan again, I will tell my family. I will tell them what mercy looks like." The next morning, the USS Benevolence steamed into a naval anchorage near Pearl Harbor. American sailors on nearby ships saluted her passage. To them, she was more than a vessel. She was proof that even in war, humanity could still endure. When the Japanese prisoners disembarked under escort, many bowed slightly, not out of submission, but out of quiet gratitude. Commander Pierce stood at the gangway, returning the gesture with a nod. He knew that most of these men would never forget what happened aboard his ship, and in their memories, whispered years later to children, to wives, to comrades, might live the faintest spark of understanding. Because somewhere between the hatred that began the Pacific War and the compassion shown aboard a white ship bearing red crosses, something had shifted. The war would continue, yes, but aboard the USS Benevolence, for a brief, shining moment, mercy had prevailed over vengeance. And long after the guns fell silent, the story of that ship and the stunned, humbled prisoners it saved would echo as one of the quietest yet most powerful victories of the entire war.